Do you remember the good old days? Like back when we could give handshakes and hugs and there weren't any face masks and no closures and we didn't have to be 6 feet apart? Oh, the good old days when we could do things together. Those were the good old days. Maybe for you, even before COVID, you could think back to the good old days. Like I think back to high school where I could hang out with my friends. We could do things. We played sports together. My high school was small enough where I could be a part of anything I wanted to, and life just seemed simpler. When were the good old days for you? Do you go back to a certain decade? Do you go back to high school? Do you go back to college? Like when were the ideal good old days that you just wish you could go back to? Well, today as we continue talking about what life is like wandering and how to navigate through it, there's something I want you to know about the good old days. If you find yourself looking back at the good old days and longing for them, there's 2 things you should be aware of. Number 1, the good old days were hard. There were things that you had to learn and navigate through. There were problems that you needed to figure out. They had their own challenges. But maybe the thing that we like about the good old days is that we learned the lessons that they had to teach us, and we navigated our way through them so that we could at least make sense of life and figure out our place in it. The second thing we need to be aware of longing for the good old days is that the door to those days is closed. Those days are in the past, and there's no way that we can return to them. I think this is valuable for us to talk about because when it comes to wandering through uncertain times like all of us are doing right now, we have to be aware that longing for days that are past will not help us escape from our wandering in the present. This was a lesson that the Israelite people had to learn back when they were wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. They had to learn this difficult lesson that longing for the past would not allow them to escape from their wandering in the present. I want to share with you a quick reading here that illustrates what it was like for them as they were growing uncertain and afraid during their time of wandering. Today's reading is from Exodus chapter 16, when the people were getting hungry and they were starting to rebel. It says, "In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, 'If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death.'" Those were some pretty charged words and lots of emotion behind them. In that moment, they were longing for the good old days in Egypt, which, by the way, were not very good. But at least in Egypt, the Israelites knew what to expect. They knew where their food would come from, and there were things that they didn't have to figure out. Now, as they enter into the wandering, they're realizing that the good old days are behind them, and they don't have the faith to be able to navigate how God would take care of them. This is something that we still see today. When we enter into a new wandering where everything is new, everything is changed, what we so desperately want is just to go back to the good old days where maybe life wasn't perfect, but at least it was predictable, and we learned how to navigate it. But that door is closed. And no matter how much we long for those days in the past, we still won't be freed from our uncertainties in our present wandering. So the concept or the principle that I want to share with you today as we continue talking about life in the wandering and how to navigate through it is simply to illustrate for you a principle that we learn from Jesus. In fact, I wouldn't even call it a principle so much as a truth that you can anchor yourself to. Just imagine who Jesus was and what he did. He was the Son of God from all eternity. Like his home is heaven. In eternity with God. It was a perfect place without any sin, any wickedness, no uncertainty whatsoever. But what did Jesus do as you read through the Bible? The account goes that Jesus, the Son of God, became flesh. He lived among us. And if that were you, you might be walking around on earth thinking back to the good old days when you were in heaven and how things were different, but that was not what Jesus did at all. Throughout the years of his life, Jesus did not say, "Oh, I remember the good old days in heaven. I wish I could go back there." No, he was not longing for the good old days behind him. He was pursuing the cross in front of him. Imagine that. All of the good things were behind him, and yet he pursued the one thing that was the worst imaginable thing that any of us could possibly imagine: a crucifixion, an execution, so that he could be punished for people like me and you, so that he could forgive us of everything we've done. Now, I know with COVID, I wish we could go back before all this happened. I wish we could go back to the good old days, because I like to give people hugs. I like handshakes. I like physical contact. I like to be with people. To some degree, all of us do. I wish we could go back to the good old days, but at some point we have to acknowledge that the door to those days is done. It's closed. And no matter how much we might long for those days, it will not rescue us from the wandering that we're in. But the promise of Jesus is simply this: that even though the past is behind us, the best is yet to come. Just think about that for a moment. Even though we are where we are, wandering in all this uncertainty, the best is yet to come. That means two things. Number one, when Jesus came, because of what he did, he made it so that even when bad things happen, even when we're in seasons of wandering, God can use that and work it out for your good. Maybe not your definition of good, but God's definition of good. And his promise is that he will do that. Right now, he's working things out for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. Things in this life, the best is yet to come. And also things for the life to come. No matter how good this world gets, no matter how great it is, ultimately this world will always be broken. This will always be a place of wandering. And yet Jesus entered into that wandering for me and for you so that he could rescue us from it. So one day, we won't look back at the past and say, "Wow, the good old days, wish we could go back there." One day we will be in the presence of God himself, celebrating his love and goodness, celebrating how he was with us throughout our years of wandering, and celebrating life with him in heaven. And because of that, the best is yet to come.